Let's start with this story. A long time ago, a new ER resident encountered a patient who would not speak. The patient, a young woman, sat calmly on her stretcher in no apparent distress. Her vital signs were normal. Her face and neck appeared fine. There was no swelling, no trauma. She wasn't drooling. Her breathing seemed comfortable. When the resident attempted to interview the patient, she wouldn't answer. She would only point at her mouth and shake her head. The resident had her open her mouth and then looked inside. Seemed normal. The resident listened to her lungs and throat, nothing abnormal there. The resident tried again in different ways to get the patient to speak, but she would not. She would only shake her head. Then the resident realized something. If the patient is breathing normally, if her throat is not obstructed, then she should be able to make a sound, to phonate, to make any noise at all. So the resident asked her to make a sound, any sound. The patient opened her mouth, but no sound came out. That's when the resident realized what was going on, but how to confirm it, how to prove that this patient could phonate but was choosing not to. Then the resident had an idea. The resident walked out of the room, waited a moment, and then sprinted back in and kicked the stretcher as hard as they could. The sudden impact shook the bed. It didn't harm the patient, but startled them into letting out an involuntary yelp. Suspicion confirmed. The mutism was intentional, or at least not organic. The resident left again and called psychiatry to see the patient. Later it was discovered that the patient had schizophrenia and had done this before. She was admitted to the psych floor for appropriate care. It is a grave sin inside the ER to ascribe a symptom to a psychiatric cause without first confirming there is no physical ailment. Sometimes that method of confirmation can be unusual, such as injecting a patient feigning a seizure with saline while proclaiming it's Ativan, swabbing a patient's nose who's pretending to be unresponsive, or in this case, startling a patient to prove they can indeed speak. These methods might seem mean, but as long as they're not harmful, it is preferable over subjecting the patient to unnecessary testing and neglecting the true cause of their symptoms. Okay, let's get on with it. Hello, my name is Patrick Garrity. I'm an ER doc, and this is Inside the ER. A few updates. First, Buzzsprout added a new text feature. It's a neat idea, easier than sending an email, and I guess it makes sense since most people are listening on their phones. Now, each episode description has a link that says send us a text. Click it, and you can send a text that goes to the show's admin page where I can read it and later display it on our website. Pretty cool. Give it a try. However, the text I get doesn't say who it's from nor what episode they're commenting on, so be specific if you wish. Next, if you listen via Apple Podcasts, it auto-generates a transcript. But if you want the real deal, go to our website, insidetheer.buzzsprout.com, where you can now find the official transcript. Be forgiving of any typos. Remember, I write these in pages. While you're there, be sure to check out any episodes you missed. Last, we've got some social media profiles now. You can find audio clips of the podcast on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Blue Sky. Obviously, if you're already listening, you probably don't care. But if you know someone who might be interested in the show, except they just want to dip their toe in first, you could direct them to one of these profiles and they could check out a clip. I've included links in the show info. And as always, you can email us at insidetheer@gmail.com if you want to be old school with your communiques. Today you're joining us for episode 13, Psych Redux. This is going to be a continuation of episode 10 about psychiatric emergencies. There's some extra stuff I wanted to include before, but my editor told me then I was running out of time, so let's talk about it today. Okay, yes, by editor I mean me. Founder, me. Writer, me. Host, me. Producer, me. Engineer, me. It's all me. The point being, make sure you listen to episode 10 before this one, or it ain't going to make much sense. First off, I want to say that if patients present with mild or chronic psych symptoms, the ER provider often will handle the situation completely on their own and not consult a psychiatrist. What do I mean? The simplest case is a patient presenting for a medication refill. It's very common. The patient is on a long-standing psychiatric medication, they ran out, they can't get in with their doctor, so they come to the ER. As long as they're only having mild depressive thoughts, let's say, no suicidal ideation, then I'll feel confident to re-prescribe their meds and discharge them. I'll always ask these patients if they're comfortable with this, or do they still want to talk to a psychiatrist? Sometimes they do, because turns out there's more going on than they let on initially. Another example of a treat and street is someone coming in for anxiety. They don't take any meds, or maybe they used to, but not any longer, and they feel anxious today. If I think the visit is in good faith, as in the patient isn't just drug seeking, and I don't suspect a medical condition, then I'll prescribe them a short course of medication until they can follow up with someone. As I said before, one of the cardinal sins of being an ER provider is misdiagnosing a patient as having anxiety when really something serious is going on. Classic example. Someone comes in saying they're anxious, but I look and see they're tachycardic. They have a high heart rate. Have any other symptoms? Oh, you have palpitations? Oh, and chest pain? Sure, you're anxious, but maybe that's because you have a blood clot or an arrhythmia. Pinning a patient's symptoms on a psychiatric cause without due consideration is a great way to miss something serious. Patients often ask me, could this be anxiety? It could be, but my job is to rule out or at least consider the dangerous stuff. I'll never hang my hat on anxiety if the patient needs a workup first. Some people come in and are convinced something is deathly wrong with them. Hell, it seems like they want us to find something horrible. This kind of patient usually is a high utilizer of the ER. We used to say frequent flyer or friendly face, but now we're supposed to say high utilizers. Anyway, they come to the ER a lot, rarely have anything diagnosed, and are very defensive if a provider suggests there could be a psychiatric component to their complaints. But most people want to just be okay. They want to be told that nothing's wrong. Everything's fine, they can go home. That's basic human emotion, right? So whenever a patient with abnormal vitals tells me they think it's just stress, I always take it with a grain of salt. They're not lying, they're just hoping they're fine. I found many pulmonary embolisms, PEs, blood clots in the lung, this way. I've also found many appendicitis, when a patient tells me it was just a bad burrito. Don't minimize your symptoms, people. Moving on. Right after I recorded the last Psych episode, I encountered a patient who came in for suicidal ideation. He had been seen the day before by my colleague, was evaluated by our telepsychiatrist, who recommended we admit and therefore transfer to a psychiatric hospital. So what did the patient do after that? You know, he boarded. Of course, the scourge of boarding will never end. So I go to talk to him when I'm working the next day, and he tells me he feels better and wants to leave right away. Not so fast, I tell him. You came in for SI, and the psychiatrist recommended admission. I can't let you just walk out. And then he says, I walked in on my own, so I'm allowed to leave whenever I want. No. I tried to explain why that wasn't true, but he just started yelling at me, so I don't think it's sunk in. Thankfully, you can't yell at me, so I can explain it to you. I guess you can write me an angry email at insidetheer@gmail.com or an angry text via the episode description, so feel free. No matter how you get to the ER, whether you walk in or are brought in, if we think you're a danger to yourself or others, then you lose that ability to walk right out. Coming voluntarily to the ER doesn't mean you can leave voluntarily too if you qualify for involuntary treatment. Some patients who initially are recommended for psychiatric admission board in the ER for so long that they improve and are later discharged. For this gentleman, I had to have the telepsychiatrist reevaluate him first to make that call and let him go. The next story is a little disturbing, so be forewarned. The day after Christmas, I worked the morning shift, and EMS brings in a 70-year-old lady who had attempted suicide. When you hear this initial one-liner from EMS, you assume this lady took a bunch of pills. That's the most common method in women, especially older women. So I was very surprised and frankly freaked out to find out she'd stabbed herself multiple times. Turns out she had a long-standing history of depression, but had never made an attempt before. But her husband of decades died only weeks earlier. And on Christmas night, after her visiting family had left, her suicidal urges took over and she picked up a knife. She slashed and stabbed herself multiple times, including cutting her wrists so deeply she injured the tendons, and stabbing her abdomen so forcefully she lacerated her liver. Even though it had happened hours before I saw her, so there was no more active bleeding, it was still horrific. She was so calm. It's too calm. The whole thing rattled me in a way that rarely happens anymore. She, like the man I just mentioned, wanted to refuse something. Strangely, an IV, I almost laughed when she said it. She said, I don't want any IVs. No, I'm not an ass. It's just absurd. She stabbed herself multiple times, but now is uncomfortable with an IV? And also the idea she could even refuse care. I explained to her politely but firmly that we needed an IV to take care of her, and she complied. Now don't worry. She did fine. Her wounds were ultimately not life-threatening, and the surgical service repaired them under anesthesia in the OR. Later, of course, she was admitted to a psychiatric hospital. Oh, but how did we get her? Like, how did EMS hear about it? Simple. In the morning, she called her family and told them what she did. And I think that's the most important point here. Excluding those understandably seeking euthanasia, people that survive a suicide attempt, almost everyone regrets it. They all want help afterwards. Even this lady consented to all of the care she needed. It's a choice you can't take back, and these patients realize that and want to try to live again. As a reminder to all, if you are having thoughts of hurting yourself, please call 988, the Suicide and Crisis Hotline. Before we close out, I want to mention some news that caught my eye, in line with our last episode about United Healthcare, that further demonstrates the evil of for-profit healthcare. Let's go ahead and sound a warning for anyone that has to interact with Acadia Healthcare. They run over 200 facilities, including over 50 psychiatric hospitals and the largest chain of methadone clinics in the U.S. The initial article that brought them to my attention was by the New York Times called How a Leading Chain of Psychiatric Hospitals Traps Patients. It's a great, rage-inducing read. I put a link in the show notes, but there is a paywall, so forgive me. In summary, it details allegations that Acadia's psych hospitals have a pattern of lying about patient symptoms so they can detain them against their will much longer than necessary, all to maximize their billing. One such patient was a school social worker held for 6 days against her will, even though she had no suicidal or homicidal urges. Now, of course, she and others like her are scared to seek psychiatric care in the future in fear of repeating this nightmare. The thing is with this company, Acadia, the more you dig, the more crap you find. Numerous allegations, including inappropriately prescribing methadone, sexual abuse, intentional fraudulent billing, and falsifying medical records. Just look at the legal and ethical issues section of Acadia Healthcare's Wikipedia page. It's truly astounding. There thankfully seems to be some punishment for these ghouls, as in September 2024, they agreed to pay the U.S. government nearly $20 million in settlement due to the inappropriate hospitalizations we mentioned. I'll put a link in the Department of Justice press release in the show notes. But as I said last episode, the fines these companies have to pay is minuscule compared to their profits, and no one at the top is truly punished. Having a fake, hopefully amusing ad break doesn't seem to fit the vibe of today's episode. So let's forget that, and let me give you this advice before we go. Do not let anything I've said dissuade you from seeking psychiatric care if you need it. It takes bravery to get help, and you are brave. In all my years, I've personally never encountered a situation where I thought a patient was being held against their will inappropriately. What I mean to say is that I think most patients are getting the appropriate care. But if you do find yourself in this situation seeking psychiatric care, tell a loved one where you are going so they know to check up on you. An informed family member is a great defense against an abusive institution. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed the episode, or at the very least learned something. Please follow the show if you haven't already, and we'll be back next month. In the meantime, check out the socials, shoot us a text, sling us an email, leave a rating, bang out a review, whatever you want to do. Thanks for listening, and all the best.